Hey Carl, did I ever tell you that my mother's sister practices witchcraft? She's a witch. No, Carl, she doesn't have green skin and warts. Come on, get those ridiculous ideas out of your head. Talking, actual sort of, real genuine witchcraft here. The good stuff. So, she's my mother's sister, and she practices witchcraft. You know what that makes her? My coven aunt. You get it? She's my covenant. Covenant? Because the theme of the video is covenants. We gotta do something for the beginning, Carl. Gotta do something. Oh, I have an idea. Okay, how about this? Check this out. Ready? Covenant, the musical. Covenant is the theme of this video. We could work on the lyrics. Oh, whatever, Carl, just roll it. Hi, and welcome to this week's video lecture. Today we're going to discuss covenants in the Hebrew Scriptures. We have three main goals with this video. First, we want to define the idea of covenant, give it a definition, and also try to understand it in its historical context with regard to the Hebrew Scriptures. Second, we're going to look at four major covenants in the Hebrew Scriptures: the Noahic covenant, the Abrahamic covenant, the Mosaic covenant, and the Davidic covenant. Finally, we're going to briefly explore the role and significance of covenant in the Hebrew Scriptures. All right, let's get started. In its most basic sense, the word covenant refers to a relational agreement, an alliance, a contract, though that word doesn't quite do it justice. It's about a vow, a pact between two individuals or two groups that is binding upon each. The idea of covenants wasn't unique to the Hebrew Scriptures or to the people of Israel. It was a common theme in the ancient Near East. Carl, should I define the ancient Near East? Why should I bother? Everything you need to know about it's in the name. When? Ancient. Come to think of it, that's actually a little bit vague, isn't it? Okay, but where? Near East. That's a little bit vague too. And who came up with this name? Doesn't tell you anything. Alright, fine, I'll define it quickly. The ancient in ancient Near East refers to a pretty broad period of time, and it's debated as to when it begins and when it ends. Generally speaking, though, we can start probably about 4,000 years BCE, that is, before the Common Era. And it can go to either the 6th or 4th century BCE, or even until the 6th century CE. For our purposes, we don't have to worry about exactly when it begins and when it ends. We just have to know that the time frame encompasses pretty much everything that we're going to read about in the Hebrew Scriptures. The where of the ancient Near East, the Near East, has some overlap with modern-day Middle East. It included kingdoms like Assyria, Babylon, Palestine, Egypt, and Persia. Again, the exact borders of the ancient Near East aren't as important as the acknowledgement for us that everything that happens within the Hebrew Scriptures happens within this socio-political and historical context. In other words, the ancient Near East provides important information about the world behind the text of the Hebrew Scriptures. The idea of covenant is no exception. Covenants were extremely common in the ancient Near East, and they even had particular formulas they would follow. There are two types of covenants we want to consider in the context of the ancient Near East. One is the obligatory covenant. The second was the suzerain vassal covenant. This kind of covenant was between a greater power and a lesser power, and it followed a particular formula usually. First, the suzerain, the leader, the greater power, would be named. Then there would be a historical statement about what the suzerain has done on behalf of the vassal, that is, why the vassal might owe them something. Finally, the terms of the covenant are laid out. We'll see this pattern within some of the covenants we explore in the Hebrew Scriptures. Of course, the term covenant itself is an English term. It comes from a Hebrew word, berith, which has the connotation of cutting or eating, because oftentimes these covenants were sealed with animal sacrifice. So the notion of cutting or eating was part of the deal. There's a fair amount of debate about how many covenants there actually are in the Hebrew Scriptures. We don't have to concern ourselves with that debate right now, because we're not going to provide an exhaustive list. We're just going to look at four very important covenants in the Hebrew Scriptures. But before we go into these covenants, it's important to note that for many Hebrews and Jews, it's not like these are all completely separate covenants. Some of them, for instance the Mosaic covenant, build upon other fundamental covenants, for example, the Abrahamic covenant. So it's not like one covenant replaces the other. Rather, God is building upon God's relationship with God's people, in this case, the Israelites. It's also important to note that these covenants have been in some ways subsumed and reinterpreted by Christians. For example, the Davidic covenant has been interpreted as being fulfilled in Jesus, who serves as the Messiah and the eternal King on the throne. I'm not going to focus too much on these readings of the text because my aim here is to try to understand the text in their historical context as they would have been heard by the original audience. One final caveat. We're going to explore and expand these covenants a bit more in the coming videos, so this is quite a thumbnail sketch. Thank goodness, Carl, because I'm pretty sure some of them have already turned off the video. What do you mean you turned off the video? You're recording it, Carl. Better be careful. I'm gonna find myself a new whatever it is that you do. The first of the 4 covenants that we want to explore is the Noahic covenant. This covenant occurs after the Great Flood in primeval history. God floods the entire world, killing almost everything that exists except Noah and his family and the animals that Noah has saved. After the flood is over, God makes a covenant with Noah, Noah's family, and every creature on the planet. This covenant is laid out in Genesis chapter 9, where it states, "As for me, in this context God, I am establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the domestic animals, and every animal of the earth with you, as many as come out of the ark. I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth." God said, "This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you, for all future generations. I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth, and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the water shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth." God said to Noah, "This is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth." The Noahic covenant is interesting among the covenants that we're going to discuss because it clearly and explicitly applies to all living creatures. So it's not just between God and Israel or God and a particular people or even between God and the human species. It's between God and every single creature on the planet. And it's an eternal covenant, so it continues to include every creature that comes into existence. And the covenant at its base is the claim that God will never again do this sort of violence. After primeval history, we begin a more historical unfolding of the narrative, and it begins with a man named Abram, who will later become named Abraham. God makes a covenant with Abram, and this covenant is outlined in a few different places between chapters 12 and chapter 17 in the book of Genesis. In chapter 12, God states that he's going to bless Abram and make Abram great so that Abram can be a blessing to all the other nations of the earth. What's interesting about this claim is it begins to signal that the blessing of God's people, Abraham's people, what will become Israel, is in some sense to flow outward from Israel to be a blessing to all other human families on the earth. But the more specific ramifications of the covenant are laid out in chapters 15 and 17. Let's take a look at chapter 15. "Then God said to Abram, I am the Lord who brought you from Ur of the Chaldeans, to give you this land to possess. But he said, O Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it? God said to him, Bring me a heifer 3 years old, and a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a pigeon. He brought them all these and cut them in two, laying each half over against the others. But he did not cut the birds in two. When the sun had gone down, and it was dark, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, To your descendants I give this land. Now you'll note that formula that we mentioned earlier of the suzerain vassal covenant. God is identified, the Lord, and what God has done for Abram is identified. I am the one who brought you out of the land of the Chaldeans. You'll also note again that significance of the notion of cutting. These animals are brought together, cut in two, and set in 2 rows. The idea here is that someone would pass in between the animals, which would seal the covenant. Genesis chapter 17 lays out the covenant, but from a different authorial perspective. 3 things are worth noting here. First, there's an emphasis on the notion of land, on descendants, and on becoming a great nation. Second, in Genesis chapter 17, the covenant is explicitly referred to as an eternal covenant, that is, never ending. Finally, in Genesis 17, a sign of the covenant is established, and this is the sign of circumcision, a practice that continues to be immensely important for Jews today. In essence, then, this covenant establishes the importance of Abram, now Abraham, as the father of many nations. Interestingly enough, this notion will continue to pay dividends in different religions, not just Judaism. On the one hand, it is important for Judaism because Jews trace their lineage back to Abraham through his grandson Jacob. Christianity also traces itself back to Abraham, not in the sense of a direct unbroken lineage, but in the sense of being adopted as children of Abraham through the work of Jesus, who himself was related to Abraham. Finally, Muslims also trace themselves back to Abraham through a different grandson, Ishmael. This is why these three religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, are often referred to as the Abrahamic faiths. You'll recall from our previously explored historical overview of the Hebrew Scriptures that the people of Abraham, Israel, end up enslaved in Egypt. There's a very large story about how they get out of Egypt, referred to as the Exodus. After they leave Egypt, God establishes a covenant with the people through a man named Moses. This covenant is referred to as the Mosaic covenant. Again, we have hints of the suzerain-vassal formula here. For example, in Exodus chapter 19, the text states, "The Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, 'Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the Israelites, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession out of all peoples. Indeed, the whole earth is mine, but you shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the Israelites.'" So in keeping with that suzerain-vassal formula, you have the identification of God and what God has done for the people. And then you have the terms of the covenant. Interestingly, this covenant is conditional. If you keep my commandments, you shall be my treasured people. Both God and the people have a part that they have to play in the covenant, and God will only honor God's part if the people honor their part. The Mosaic covenant is important also because it establishes the law of Israel. Many people overgeneralize this law down to the 10 Commandments. However, it's interesting to note that in Judaism, there are no less than 613 commandments of the Mosaic law. And in the book of Exodus, while there are the 10 Commandments listed, there are lots of commandments and laws after that listed as well. Another important thing to note here is that this covenant, according to Jews, applies only to Jews. Again, think of that suzerain-vassal formula. God is speaking to a particular people with whom God has had a particular historical narrative. Consider even the first of the 10 Commandments. The first commandment states, "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me." It's tempting to think of the 10 Commandments as just beginning with, "Have no other gods before me." But again, the covenant has that formula. "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt." This signals that this covenant is meant for a particular people, the Israelites. Unlike the Noahic covenant, it is not a universal covenant. The Mosaic covenant and the law that accompanies it becomes immensely important for the identity of Israel and continues to have great importance for the identity of Jews today. This is also the point in history where Israel has the Ark of the Covenant. Think of it as like a very fancy box that maintains and keeps the records of this particular covenant, the Mosaic covenant. And Israel carries this around with them everywhere that they go in a large tent. That's sort of like a mobile temple that they can take as they're wandering through the desert and living in this sort of nomadic existence. The fourth and final covenant we want to explore is the Davidic covenant. This covenant occurs after Israel transitions to a monarchy. Again, look back at the previous video in which we do our historical overview to kind of fit that into the historical narrative. The historical context for this covenant is that David, the second king of Israel, has finally settled most of his wars. His enemies are no longer a threat to him and he's finding a moment of peace. He then decides that he wants to build a house for God, a permanent house, not the tent that has been moving around up to this point. God says that he does not want David to build him a house, that one of his heirs will build a house. But God also then promises that he will build a house for David, or a house of David. And here the notion of house means more dynasty. Let's take a look at the text, 2 Samuel chapter 7, to understand this covenant a bit more. "When your days are fulfilled, and you lie down with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come forth from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be a father to him, and he shall be a son to me. When he commits iniquity, I will punish him with a rod such as mortals use, with blows inflicted by human beings. But I will not take my steadfast love from him. Your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. A few important things stand out. First, God is making a covenant not just with David, but with David's ancestors after him. David will always have an heir on the throne. This is an eternal or everlasting covenant. Second, the covenant notes that David's ancestors might be disobedient, but this disobedience will not lead God to remove God's steadfast love. That is, God will not violate the covenant based on their disobedience. For some Jews and many Christians, the Davidic covenant has messianic overtones. That is, it points to the idea that God will raise up some person in the line of David who will rescue the Jews and who will establish their kingdom forever. Christians often read this covenant as fulfilled in Jesus. For many Jews, the covenant remains unfulfilled until the Messiah actually comes. Having briefly looked at these four covenants, the Noahic covenant, the Abrahamic covenant, the Mosaic covenant, and the Davidic covenant, let's take a few moments to discuss the role and significance of covenants in the Hebrew Scriptures. You recall early on that I noted that the term contract doesn't quite do justice to covenants. Covenants are more than just a contract, which almost has a cold, business-like feel to it. Covenants are deep relational commitments, vows. And it's interesting to note that God makes these commitments with human beings, and indeed with all creatures on the planet. In that sense, the role of covenant is to establish this ongoing narrative between God and the world. God wants to be related to the world. So what's the significance of this? Well, three things are worth mentioning. First, covenants reveal the belief that God desires to be in a relationship with the world. Sometimes this is a universal concern, for instance with the Noahic covenant, and sometimes it's much more particular. For example, the Mosaic covenant and the Davidic covenant tend to be relegated to the people of Israel. Second, the theme of covenant reveals the belief that God is connected to and invested in the world. That is, God has a stake in the world. God does not simply create, wipe God's hands, and then disappear. God remains engaged, seeking interaction. God seems to want the world to turn out a certain way, and God even seems to maybe even need to work with other humans to get the world to turn out that way. The third significance of covenant is that God binds God's self to the world. Recall that covenants have a mutual dimension to them. It's not just that God says, do this for me. God also notes that God will do something for others. I will never flood the earth again. I will make your name great and increase your descendants and give you land. You will be my treasured people in all of the earth. You will always have someone on the throne. God is making promises in the covenants, and these promises bind God to the world and to particular people. Think of it this way. Every covenant that God makes limits what God can do moving forward. God can no longer flood the earth. God can no longer forsake the people of Israel. God is bound to honor the parameters of the covenant, with the exception of the conditional covenants that require other people to be obedient as well. This theme will come up again later when we consider, for instance, what happened to these covenants that God made with the people of Israel during the Shoah, the Holocaust. Why was God not honoring the terms of these covenants? This is a very interesting conversation and leads to some fascinating discussions, but we're going to have to table those for now. The main point here is to note that the significance of covenant demonstrates that God seeks relationships and is somehow affected, invested in, and bound to those relationships. In this video, we took some time to discuss the basic notion of covenant, including its place in its historical context of the ancient Near East. We discussed 4 covenants in the Hebrew Scriptures. Finally, we unpacked the role and significance of covenants in the Hebrew Scriptures. Next week, we're going to focus a bit more closely on Abraham, his historical narrative, and the Abrahamic covenant. Until then, covenant, defend,